On February 18, 1930, Clyde Tombaugh, a 23-year-old astronomer at Lowell Observatory in Flagstaff, Arizona, made one of the great scientific discoveries of the century. Tombaugh was examining a pair of photographs using a blink comparator, a tool that allowed users to quickly toggle between two images. The photos Tombaugh was studying had been taken less than a month earlier by the observatory's 13-inch telescope. The two images had been taken 6 days apart and were of precisely the same section of the night sky. They were virtually identical, except for a faint point of light that seemed to jump from one position to another. Clyde Tombaugh had discovered a 9th planet in our solar system. After confirming the discovery, the astronomers at Lowell Observatory voted to name the planet Pluto, after the ancient Greek god of the underworld. It was headline news all across the globe. Our understanding of the universe had been expanded. Maps of the solar system were redrawn. Textbooks were rewritten. From now on, there were 9 planets. From now on lasted about 76 years, as it turned out. Beginning in the early 1990s, astronomers began discovering other objects in Pluto's neighborhood of the solar system. The region where Pluto and these other objects are located was named the Kuiper Belt. Today, around 1,000 objects have been identified in the Kuiper Belt, and it's theorized that the region may be home to as many as 100,000 objects in total. Then, in 2005, astronomers discovered Eris, an object about the same size as Pluto, located far beyond the Kuiper Belt. So, was Eris the 10th planet? Some astronomers thought so at first, but others pointed out that if Eris was recognized as a planet, it would only make sense to confer planet status on other objects with comparable characteristics. What about Sedna, discovered in 2003, which also orbited the Sun in the outer reaches of the solar system? What about Haumea and Makemake, 2 large Kuiper Belt objects that had been discovered in 2004 and 2005, respectively? Part of the problem was that the definition of planet was too imprecise. So in August of 2006, the International Astronomical Union convened its General Assembly and hammered out a new official definition of a planet. According to the IAU's new definition, a planet in our solar system is an object that orbits the Sun, exhibits hydrostatic equilibrium, that is, it's big enough for its gravity to force it into a round shape, and clears the neighborhood around its orbit. In other words, it, along with its satellites, if it has any, is the dominant object in the region surrounding its orbital path. Pluto orbits the Sun. Pluto is massive enough to have a round shape, but Pluto doesn't clear its neighborhood. It shares its orbit with other Kuiper Belt objects. So, as of August 24, 2006, according to the world's preeminent astronomical organization, Pluto was no longer a planet. It was a controversial decision and still is to this day. When the new definition was adopted, some were satisfied, some were annoyed, and many, mostly lay people, like myself, were just confused. Wasn't it a fact that Pluto was a planet? It was basic astronomy. We learned that stuff in elementary school. There were 9 planets: Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. Most people couldn't remember it ever being any different. How could Pluto be a planet up until August of 2006, then all of a sudden not be a planet? What changed about Pluto? But of course, nothing changed about Pluto. What had changed between 1930 and 2006 was our understanding of our solar system. Given that new, more complete understanding, it made sense, to a lot of people anyway, including a majority of members of the IAU, to revise our concept of what a planet was. And that was an option because planet is a constructed concept. It's an idea that people invented that refers to an object that exists out there in the world. For that idea to be useful to us, it has to represent that actual object as accurately as possible. And if through the gaining of new information, we learn that our concept is not as accurate as we thought it was, the only sensible thing to do is to alter the concept accordingly. It's impossible for us to think about or talk about the world around us without using constructed concepts. The objects we define as planets would exist as they are whether we were here or not, but they're only defined as planets because we say they are. For everyday purposes, the distinction between a thing and our constructed concept of the thing isn't usually important. When we look at a tree, we don't think to ourselves, there is an object which exists independent of our perception of it, but which for our convenience we conceptualize as a tree. We think, there's a tree. We treat our idea of the thing as though it is actually the thing. We think of our concept of reality as though it were reality itself. Despite their necessity, our attachment to our constructed concepts can become a problem when we learn new information that challenges the long-held understanding on which those concepts were based. Which brings me to why trans women are women. Just as we all grew up in a world where it was an established scientific fact that Pluto was a planet, most of us also were taught to take for granted that gender was a binary concept. There were men, and there were women, and there were easily discernible factors that determined who belonged in which category. There are several widely known and practiced methods for distinguishing men from women. The most obvious difference between the genders in the minds of most people is our genitalia. As anyone who's seen Kindergarten Cop can tell you, boys have a penis and girls have a vagina. Another way is by the size of the gametes an individual produces. Gametes are the cells that fuse together during fertilization and sexual reproduction. Females produce the larger gametes, which we call ova or eggs, and males produce the smaller gametes, which we call spermatozoa, or sperm. And still another way is by sex chromosomes, also called allosomes. The cells of females carry 2 X allosomes, while the cells of males carry an X and a Y allosome. All three of these methods presume a simple black and white concept of gender that is ultimately rooted in readily observable biological characteristics. You're either a man or you're a woman, and it's easy to tell which is which. Most people regard the gender binary as a fundamental fact of life. It's basic biology. It's one of the first things we learn about ourselves. It's a major influence on how we organize our societies and how we perceive each other. Boy-girl, penis-vagina, sperm-egg, XX, XY. It's familiar, it's comfortable, it's common knowledge, and it's not fully representative of reality. In 1972, Dr. Albert de la Chapelle published a paper in the American Journal of Human Genetics titled Nature and Origin of Males with XX Sex Chromosomes. The paper was a review of data relating to individuals who, for the most part, were typically male, but who carried XX allosomes. Today, this condition is called XX male syndrome, and it occurs in about 1 in 20,000 men. There's a similar condition called XY gonadal dysgenesis, or Swyer syndrome if you prefer, the result of which is women who carry XY allosomes. Swyer syndrome is even less common than XX male syndrome, affecting approximately 1 in 80,000 women. Swyer syndrome also frequently requires more significant medical intervention, as it prevents puberty from occurring naturally. Most individuals with the condition undergo hormone replacement therapy to promote the development of typically female secondary sex characteristics. Both of these conditions are extremely rare. Of the approximately 130 million people born every year around the world, only about 4,000 will have either XX male syndrome or Swyer syndrome. But the prevalence of these conditions isn't the point. The point is, people who have these conditions are still regarded as genuine members of their genders. Men with XX male syndrome are still men. Women with Swyer syndrome are still women. Their existence is evidence that gender isn't always determined by the type of sex chromosomes a person carries. Chromosomal sex determination may be a reliable method in general, and the XX equals woman, XY equals man dichotomy might account for the great majority of people, but it doesn't include everyone. And by the way, neither do the boys have a penis, girls have a vagina, or women make eggs, men make sperm dichotomies. Are those statements typically true? Yes. But are they rigid, immutable, universal truths? No. Reality, as it turns out, is a lot more complex than that. It's currently estimated that approximately 1 out of every 250 adults in the United States is transgender. That means their gender identity, their personal, internal experience of their gender, is different than the gender they were assigned at birth. The prefix trans comes from Latin and means on the other side of. So a transgender person is someone who is on the other side of their assigned gender. People like me who do identify with the gender we were assigned at birth, that is, people who are not trans, are called cisgender. Cis is a prefix that also comes from the Latin, and it means on the same side of. So cis people are those of us who are on the same side as our assigned gender. This next point is very important, and it's something that everyone, but most especially cis people like me, who are overwhelmingly in the majority, must understand. When a trans man says, "I'm a man," he isn't pretending to be something he's not. When a trans woman says, "I'm a woman," she's not asking the rest of us to indulge her in a fantasy that she has concocted for herself. When a trans person expresses their gender, they aren't trying to deceive anybody. They are telling us something fundamental about themselves, something that is no less true for them than my gender identity is for me, or any other cis person's gender identity is for them. Just like the concept of a planet, the concept of gender is a construct people came up with in an effort to better understand the world in which we live. Men are men, and women are women because they fit into categories we defined in order to describe how our bodies work, how we interact with each other, how we perceive ourselves to be. For most of the history of our species, the gender binary and the various methods I've been discussing of distinguishing one gender from another seemed adequate to describe those things. But now we know different, whether we want to admit that to ourselves or not. Now we know that gender isn't a binary, it's a spectrum. I haven't mentioned this yet, but some people have a gender identity that falls outside the man-woman either-or dichotomy. They identify as pangender or agender or third gender or gender fluid or something else entirely. The typical concept of gender fails to account for them, and yet they exist. I also haven't drawn a distinction in this video between gender and physiological sex, but if you find such a distinction useful, you might be interested to know, if you don't know already, that physiological sex isn't binary either. It also exists on a spectrum, with typically male people at one end, typically female people at the other, and all sorts of fascinating and wonderful variations in between. When the 19th century began, most astronomers thought of every point of light they could see in the night sky as either a star or a planet, and telling the difference between the two was easy. The positions of stars relative to each other remained fixed, while planets moved from location to location across the sky. It worked. It seemed like an adequate definition. That which was not a star was a planet. It seemed to describe the universe as astronomers of the era understood it to be. Then, in 1801, Giuseppe Piazzi discovered Ceres. Initially, it was considered a planet, but in the years that followed, similar objects were discovered. By the end of 1851, 15 such objects had been identified. Astronomers decided it didn't make sense to classify all of these newly discovered objects as planets, and they obviously weren't stars. They didn't fit into either established category. So the astronomers of the mid-19th century did the only thing they could do. They revised their two traditional categories and added a third for objects like Ceres: asteroids. When they discovered their familiar, comfortable concept of the universe was inadequate, when they found the world they were studying to be more complex than they thought it was, the astronomers of the 19th century revised their concept. The astronomers of the IAU did the same thing with the definition of planet in 2006. If the constructed concepts we rely on to make sense of the world, the categories we sort things into, the terminology we use to talk about things, turn out to be inaccurate or inadequate, the only sensible thing to do is to revise those concepts, to augment them, to reinterpret them, to change them, to make them better represent reality as we understand it. Otherwise, they're not doing the job that we need them to be doing. If our concepts of gender account only for those who are in the majority, only for those who are typical, and ignore the significant percentage of people who exist outside of those traditional categories, then those concepts don't fully represent reality. They're not doing the job. We shouldn't be relying on them, and we most certainly should not be using them to justify bigotry and discrimination. Trans women are women. Trans men are men. Non-binary people are non-binary. These are facts which you're free to dispute if you like, but if you're going to base your dispute on common knowledge or an understanding of gender that you got from a high school biology class, you should know that doing that makes about as much sense as citing an old astronomy textbook to argue that Pluto is still a planet. You're entitled to your opinion, I suppose, but your definitions are a little out of date.